A lot of people don't think through the consequences of a political assassination. They're concerned with the assassination itself. They're concerned with the cover-up. They're concerned with the people responsible for the crime getting away safely. But they don't think through the extent to which the cover-up itself may implicate the government. If you find signs of concealment, you perhaps cannot prove what is being concealed, but you can still demonstrate the fact of the concealment itself. And in instances like the assassination of JFK, former President of the United States, or his brother, RFK, the Bobby Kennedy assassination, you have evidence, incontrovertible evidence of a cover-up, of concealment, and that implicates the government even if you cannot prove what is being concealed or why. Very briefly, for example, when you look at the details surrounding the medical autopsy after the assassination of JFK, you have evidence there of government responsibility, not necessarily for the killing, but yeah, if you look into it, pretty obviously it does lead you to conclude the government was responsible for the killing. You have evidence there of concealment that the mafia could not possibly be responsible for. You have evidence of concealment that the Cubans could not be responsible for, that the Russian government could not be responsible for. I mention these things because in the past there were people who believed that the assassination of JFK, possibly Russia, Cuba, or the American mafia were responsible for it. Those people could not possibly be inside the medical and military establishment engaged in the cover-up. So the cover-up itself implicates higher levels of responsibility within the American government. Now, there's been a significant assassination in Cambodia in 2017. By making this video, it may actually become unsafe for me to ever visit Cambodia again, or at least for the next couple of years. I have no plans to return to Cambodia. And I wonder, actually, one of the articles I've read here criticizing the current situation in Cambodia, I was Googling, trying to figure out if that journalist is still in Cambodia or if she'd been kicked out or exiled, because this is not safe to talk about. And just recently, in the last couple months in 2018, a Cambodian woman has been imprisoned and fined and put on trial for making statements on Facebook, suggesting or presuming, perhaps, that the government was responsible for this assassination. Now, I'm going to read you a short quotation from a New York Times article on the topic. The defendant, so the defendant here being the man who apparently carried out the assassination, the defendant insisted in court that Chawb Somlap was his real name. He said that he was an unmarried orphan who grew up in a province on Cambodia's western border and that he had earned the money to buy the gun. It says to buy the Glock. A Glock is a brand of a firearm. He earned the money to buy the gun by working on a cassava plantation in Thailand. It's a type of low-level farming employment. But nearly every detail of that story was contradicted by his mother and his wife. They said that he was neither an orphan nor a migrant worker, but a former forest ranger and soldier from an entirely different province. They said that they had never heard the name Chawb Somlap before. That's not his real name. And they even produced a fingerprinted identity card indicating that the man in the dock, the man in court who was confessing to this crime, was in fact named Uth Ang. Who else could arrange for someone using a false name to appear in court and take responsibility for this crime? So again, the assassination of RFK, Robert Kennedy, who was then running for president. So people normally call him Bobby Kennedy. He was then running for president of the United States. He wasn't yet president of the United States. Most people think he would have won the election. His assassination, it did have a patsy. There was a man who was assigned guilt, who was tried and convicted of the crime. But again, there are elements of concealment of evidence, cover-up, where if you simply look at the concealment, you don't need to speculate on what's being concealed. Who is capable of that concealment? Who is capable of contriving this situation within the Cambodian court and justice system to have fake identity papers, a fake identity, a fake conviction? Who could have arranged this? Not the mafia, not spies from Japan. This is the problem. And I just have to say this. The assassinations of RFK and JFK were amateur. The American authorities that engaged in that were laughably amateurish in carrying that out. It should be impossible for someone like me to figure out and assign responsibility. It should be impossible in Cambodia for the New York Times to have figured this out. But, I mean, perhaps nobody expects such a high level of competence from the government of Cambodia. But any illusions we might have about the omnipotence or very high level of competence of repressive state governments, these are actually instructive examples of. In fact, the assassination of JFK was so amateurish that I've often wondered if there wasn't dissent within the U.S. government, that people weren't being intentionally inept, that they weren't intentionally leaving breadcrumbs or signs of what was wrong because they wanted it to be figured out by the public. That some of the people following orders were only reluctantly following orders. So I'm going to read you a little bit more about the current situation in Cambodia. And, I've said a long time ago on this channel, there's a sense in which I make these videos with a really broken-hearted feeling of contempt for my audience, actual potential. It's very sad to come on camera and talk about political issues that you know matter, that you feel are tremendously important, and you know your audience doesn't care about, and you know there is, in a sense, no potential audience that cares about it. That's a very saddening thing, whether I'm talking about the Cree and the Ojibwe and First Nations politics, I'm talking about politics in Cambodia. There is no audience for this content, and there is no government concern, and nobody cares. And I can only appeal to my audience to examine their own lack of concern and engagement, because the vast majority of people watching this video are vegans. And vegans go around all the time weeping and wringing their hands and pulling their hair, saying, why does nobody care? Here's this terrible travesty, this crime, this animal cruelty, the devastation of the environment, this terrible, even economic waste. There's even an economic argument about not eating meat, totally kind of amoral argument for it. But whether you look at it ethically, ecologically, or in terms of health impacts, why does nobody care about the millions of heart attacks and cases of cancer that could be avoided, et cetera, et cetera? Right, we have to proceed from the shocking fact that nobody cares, right? And the shocking fact is that situations like this in Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos, nobody cares. Nobody cares even enough to respond symbolically. The government of Japan is not even willing to close down its embassy. The government of Japan is not willing to lower the Cambodian flag to half-mast. The United Nations is not willing to even symbolically oppose a situation of what can frankly be called tyranny. And I disclaim again, I have no inside information. I make no claim that the government of Cambodia is responsible for this political assassination. I can't say that. It would be unjust of me to say that with certainty. What I can say is that Cambodia today does not meet the minimum standards of democracy, that it is a tyranny, and that the whole world ought to stand up and close ranks and cut off Cambodia from the society of nations. There are ways to bring about political change through engagement, through intervention, but there's also political change you can bring about simply through disentanglement. The Canadian government could very easily ban tourism to Cambodia. The Canadian government wouldn't cost the Canadian government a dime to close down the Cambodian embassy here or put the Cambodian flag at half-mast and say, no, when you cross certain ethical lines, when you fail to meet certain ethical standards, we don't regard you as a legitimate democracy anymore, and to have one standard that applies to the whole world. In the year 2018, this would not be too much to ask. And indeed, this is not even a situation like Saudi Arabia where there would be economic consequences to opposing or questioning the legitimacy of the Saudi government. It would not cost Western powers a dime. It wouldn't cost Japan a dime to do the right thing for the right reason. So I read this article titled States of Repression by Miranda Johnson. Googling, I couldn't find any trace of her. I wonder if the journalist is using a false name for that reason. Subtitle, Elections in Cambodia and Thailand Will Be Shams. Roaming the streets near the Independence Monument in Phnom Penh, so this is downtown in the capital city, Phnom Penh, can prove to be a grim tour. Critics of the government have met mysterious ends in the area. One, Kem Lay, was assassinated over his morning coffee in a Caltex petrol station in July of 2016. This is now known as Kem's Caltex, a local relates with dark humor. So I just pause. When I lived in Cambodia, it was prior to this assassination, but in the same way, there were different sites you saw around downtown Cambodia. It was like, oh yeah, that magazine stand. It was a magazine and newspaper stand where an important politician, he was actually a labor union leader who dared to criticize the government, was gunned down, where different people were killed for daring to criticize the government. And in the various coups d'etats that established the power of the Hun Sen regime, but there was one of the embassies too, where members of parliament from the opposition party had been murdered and so on. So there were different sites. I mean, the more reading you did, the more you learned about the ghosts of downtown Phnom Penh. And none of this is Khmer Rouge. None of this is all the democratic, modern, current history of Cambodia's. We're basically talking about the 1990s to present here. And this news I'm talking about today, this is 2016, 17, 2018, and current and ongoing news in Cambodia. This is not ancient history. This is not from the communist period. I continue. Those worried about Cambodia's elections in July find such events hard to laugh at. Hun Sen, the prime minister, seized power in 1985 after the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge and the intervention of Vietnamese forces. He says he will rule for another decade. The election will do little to disturb his plans, period. Now, this is a news article, but the summary there of Cambodian history and how Hun Sen came to power, this is doing a bit of an injustice to history, okay? There were elections. The elections were stage managed by the United Nations. I'm going to get upset if I start talking about what happened at that time. There's a really dark history here, and there's blood on a lot of people's hands, including the United Nations, for what happened. There were elections, and those elections probably were illegitimate to begin with in terms of the role the United Nations played. And then the United Nations allowed those elections to be subverted and overturned, and for the loser of the election to take over government by armed force, what you could call a coup d'etat or what have you. But that was not a bloodless coup d'etat. It's true, relatively few people died compared to the Khmer Rouge, what have you. It's not on the list of great mass murder events, but it was not a bloodless coup d'etat. Right? So I just mentioned this, very briefly alluding to the violence that established the Hun Sen regime in the first place. Okay? I continue. The head of the opposition, so this is the head of the opposition electoral party. This isn't some kind of underground resistance movement. This would be like the head of the Democrat Party in a Republican-dominated United States. This is the head of the mainstream Democratic Party that runs against the ruling party in elections. In as much as there are elections, you'll get the sense that the elections barely exist. The head of the opposition, Kem Sokha, was arrested on trumped-up treason charges in September of 2017. Cambodian law forbids convicted criminals from running in political parties. The opposition could implode after the government launched legal action to dissolve it in October 2017 for supposedly plotting to topple the regime. Voices likely to criticize the crackdown have been silenced. Several American-funded radio broadcasters were taken off the air in the weeks after Kem Sokha's arrest, and the country's best independent newspaper was forced to close. Organizations promoting democracy and campaigning for green causes have been targeted too. So we didn't get any sense of the background to the assassination of Kem Lay. My understanding is that he was assassinated because he made some casual comments. I mean, at that time, he had been a critic of the government for a relatively long time, but he made some sarcastic comments about a report that was published by a group called Global Witness. They're a nonprofit foundation, and that report was estimating how much money Hun Sen's family had amassed through corrupt, illegal, and illicit practices while they'd been in power. So they came up with a very round figure of $200 million, but apparently he made some glib remarks about the level of corruption in government. He was already a known and respected critic of the Hun Sen regime, and then he was not so mysteriously gunned down. Intolerance is growing elsewhere in Southeast Asia. In neighboring Thailand, the ruling junta, in charge since a coup more than 3 years ago, is squeezing civic society ahead of a promised election in November 2018. You can check this on Wikipedia. There's a Wikipedia article which I think is just titled The Next Elections in Thailand, and they update that Wikipedia article on the latest excuses for why these elections never seem to happen. Given the polling has already been delayed 3 times, some doubt that the vote will occur at all. But even if it were to go ahead, democracy will be suppressed. Activities that undermine the quote-unquote public peace and order or national security, close quote, are forbidden, according to the country's interim constitution. Other statutes prevent groups of more than 5 people from gathering. Sorry, I just repeat that. This has come up when I was talking to vegans about vegan activism in Thailand. Groups of more than 5 people are illegal in Thailand. This is a problem for politicians who wish to run rallies. You'd have to have a rally with only 4 people. And punish the authors of social media posts critical of the government. So yeah, again, you couldn't even have a meeting with 4 people and then put it on Facebook. It is very common. In Thailand, if you read the newspapers there, you're always reading about people going to prison or at least going to court, having court cases about things they've said on Facebook. Yingluck Shinawatra, the opposition figurehead and the democratically elected prime minister, fled Thailand in August 2017. She jumped ship before she received the verdict on a trial of her alleged incompetence in a rice subsidy scheme, which cost the government around $16 billion. Unlike the military coup that seized power from Mrs. Yingluck's brother in 2006, this junta seems set on sticking around. That is particularly depressing, given that the country was one of Asia's freest just 2 decades ago. Although both Thailand and Cambodia are monarchies, their respective kings are not expected to meddle directly in the upcoming electoral matters. Sorry, it would be misleading to say, like, historically in the past they haven't been involved. This is really just saying they're not expected to get involved in the next year in the events coming up. The Thai junta will glory in the forthcoming coronation. Sorry, this article, obviously from a few months ago. The Thai junta will glory in the forthcoming coronation of the country's new king, Mahavajiralongkorn. For cowed voters in Thailand and Cambodia, meanwhile, the year ahead promises to be anything but glorious. Of course, this doesn't mention the other country that must be mentioned there, which is Laos, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia next door. Look, Thailand alone is a population of over 70 million people. These things matter, and they don't matter less now that we've moved into the era of social media, the death of conventional journalism, etc., etc. They matter whether or not you care about them, whether or not anyone in the West pays attention to them. And I would have been happy to devote my life to these political issues. Why? Because I could make a positive difference. I went and pursued a combination of research and humanitarian work in Southeast Asia for many years. I learned a great deal. I came back to Canada. Why is it impossible for me to get a PhD in this field? I'm not going to answer that question in this video. I just put it out there. The real ultimate problem here isn't personal indifference or media indifference. It's actually institutional and educational indifference. Obviously, I do not believe that every grade 6 school child in America or Canada can learn about Cambodian democracy, Thai democracy, Laotian democracy, or lack thereof. Frankly, it would be a wonderful lesson to share with 6th graders. It would be. You could talk through with them a bunch of case studies like this about countries that teeter on the brink of absolute tyranny, the problem with having just a little bit of democracy as opposed to a real democracy, and these kinds of things. How delicate and difficult it is to maintain democracy. It would be a wonderful thing to talk through with people in grade 6. However, it is a problem that even at elite levels of education, even in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria, and I've spent time, you guys watching the channel know, I've spent time in the elite departments of Cambridge, England, Oxford, England. I've spent time in universities, great and small, renowned and not renowned at all. It is a problem that at all elite levels of education, nobody cares about this. There is no effort to engage the public in this, or indeed, even within government. You can look up the records of debates in the Canadian Senate that we have nobody at any level who cares about these things and is engaged with these things and trying to make a positive difference. And it has been impossible for someone like myself, who independently, as an autodidact, self-learned, self-taught, went out and gained this kind of competence. It's impossible for me to take that competence and turn it into a credential and thus do something positive with it, make some kind of difference in the world, even if it is just as a critic and commentator, because you have to be outside of Thailand, you have to be outside of Cambodia, you have to be outside of Laos to be engaged with these things as a critic and a commentator. This falls in an interesting ethical category. Veganism is something everybody can do. It's not just grassroots. It's more grassroots than grassroots. It's grass dirt. What can I tell you? Anybody can do it. Anybody can make a positive difference. There are some ethical problems where your personal conduct can't make an ethical difference. This is the difference between veganism, where you can just change your diet, make a difference ecologically, ethically, and for your own health. If I want to reduce the number of accidents on the road, it's not enough for me personally to drive more slowly. I actually need to create speed limits that everyone will obey. How can I do that? It's not going to be a mass movement. They're not going to be demonstrations in the streets. They're not going to be revolutions asking for speed limits to be imposed. We all know there's an elite level of government that deals with these things, partly because, main theme of this video, nobody cares. You're not going to get broad-based engagement and support. We all resign ourselves to the fact there's a small number of people with expert opinion and engagement in these issues who are going to sit down and research it and negotiate and discuss, well, should the speed limit be 60 or 40 on this street or that street? Who are going to look at the statistics for different types of accidents in different contexts. We're going to come to that. But we feel some comfort in imagining that there is sufficient expertise in our government, that there's sufficient engagement from some small elite of highly educated people to make those technical decisions. And with these kinds of issues that are of tremendous moral significance and tremendous political significance, I can guarantee you today, in 2018, there is no such elite. There is no chorus of opinion, no matter how small. There isn't the bare minimum of a few dozen intellectuals who are engaged with these issues, who have the expertise, who have the competence to sit down and discuss these things that really matter. So I've said this about First Nations politics. My claim is not that everyone should learn Cree or that everyone should learn Ojibwe. My claim is not that everyone should learn Mohawk or Inuit. Not even one of them, nor all of them. My claim is somebody has to. And if not you, then who? I can't claim that everyone should care about the disaster that is Cambodia. My claim is somebody has to. If not you, if not me, then who?